So let me skip back to the beginning, to the origins of the revolution, so I can explain why we should see the Articles as embodying the spirit of 1776. Separating from Britain seems now like a natural outcome of being a colony, but it was surprising and perplexing at the time. It's still perplexing and intriguing for Americans today. When people present it as a revolt over taxation resulting from the huge British war debt from the French and Indian War, they're correct in the sense that the debt nearly doubled during that war, and that taxation increased. But there's good reason for skepticism, especially considering who led this revolt. Wealthy men from elite families who risked not only their property, position, and lives, but also their families' status and possessions. These leaders of the rebellion understood the odds, taking on the naval, military, commercial, and financial power of the British Empire. They begged for divine help to avert a war. They begged for divine help to fight the war, and they begged for help from other countries. They understood that the odds were stacked heavily against them. So could it really be that this expensive, demanding, and seemingly suicidal war was really a tax revolt? A tax revolt led by wealthy men who had the money to pay the new imperial taxes 100 times over? And the Tea Act illustrates this point. This was the event that sparked the revolution. This was the last straw. It eliminated the tax on tea and brought to America by the British East India Company, which lowered the price of tea for all consumers. Certainly merchants and crews in the tea trade, those who competed with the British East India Company, they didn't like this tax cut on the grounds of economic self-interest. They were priced out of the market because they didn't get that tax break. But how many such merchants and sailors were there compared to consumers? It's a handful. So it's not an economic complaint that they had. Of course, they didn't like the stamp tax itself, or the sugar tax, or the townsend duties. But what distressed them, much more than the level of taxation, was the constitutional issue of who had the authority to legislate a tax, or to legislate a tax cut for this or that company. What distressed them was the question of who governs here, the local government or the central government. And this is not me trying to read what was in the backs of their minds. They said so themselves plainly in the Declaration of Independence, where they complained of attempts by Parliament to extend unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. Unwarrantable jurisdiction by the central government over local communities. So let me create a similar scenario for our times as an illustration. If tomorrow the United Nations imposed a $10 tax on Americans, a property tax, Americans would holler and wail and resist, but we wouldn't think that it's a tax revolt. We wouldn't think Americans are resisting because the tax is too high. No doubt Americans would rather keep the $10 than pay it, but even if the tax were reduced to 1 cent, Americans would still find it intolerable that the UN claims the right to pass laws, including tax laws, on Americans. And I think any pollster will back me up on this. But why? Why is it so intolerable for the UN to tax you and me 1 cent a year? Why do we all think, even fans of the United Nations, that the UN has no such authority? If you think, it's because we value representative government. We believe that for laws to be legitimate, they have to be passed by the people themselves, through legislatures filled with people who represent them. The colonists believed the very same thing back then in the 18th century. And Americans were represented in colonial assemblies, not in Parliament. Just like we today are represented in our city hall, in our state capital, in Washington, D.C., but not in the UN. This is what we mean when we say no taxation without representation. you can't tax me unless I'm represented in the taxing body. This is what we mean when we espouse the principle of government by consent. And this is exactly what they meant by it roughly 250 years ago. They were not asking for representation in Parliament when they said no taxation without representation. Indeed, if you remember the anecdote about Benjamin Franklin floating this idea of representation in Parliament, Americans rejected it. What they were saying instead was that they would not be taxed by a Parliament in which they were not represented. They were self-governing British subjects of the king with local representative governments to legislate for them and tax them. Representative government was government by consent. Unrepresentative government was arbitrary government, as arbitrary as the rule of Charles I and James II back in 1642 and 1688. What this suggests is that the revolution was not a tax revolt. It was a constitutional opposition movement to halt the changes that the British government was enacting in the structure or constitution of the empire. In the colonial era, before the American Revolution, the empire was decentralized. It was an empire in which local settlers governed themselves locally. This was the model of empire referred to at the time as salutary neglect. Strong local governments and a weak central government in London. The revolutionary era, by contrast, saw Parliament attempting to transform the empire into a more centralized state governed from the center at the expense of self-government in local communities. And the British would continue this trend after the Revolution. The British Empire in the 19th century will operate like the kind of empire that Britain had envisioned and tried to create in America in the 1760s and 70s. This is why I suggest that the American Revolution was a conservative revolution, designed to conserve or preserve the status quo, not to change it. Britain was trying to change the status quo by moving away from salutary neglect, whereas the American rebels clamored for preserving salutary neglect.